Ethan had always known that family dinners were meant to be special occasions. The laughter, the conversations, the clinking of cutlery on fine china, it all felt like a momentary escape from the ordinary, a chance to connect with the people who were supposed to matter most. But that night, as his parents led him into the grand dining hall of the exclusive restaurant, he immediately sensed something was off. The room glimmered with crystal chandeliers, each table adorned with immaculate linen, polished silverware, and flickering candlelight. Guests dressed in elegant attire laughed softly over glasses of wine, the murmur of polite conversation filling the air. Ethan's chest tightened with anticipation. He had been looking forward to this dinner all week, imagining a night where he would feel included and valued. Then the subtle betrayal revealed itself. Instead of being guided to the large table where his parents and extended family sat, he was led to a small, slightly isolated table off to the side. It was labeled with a playful sign, "Kids' Table." His heart sank. The adults, his parents included, glanced back occasionally with smiles that felt forced, as if trying to make light of the situation. But Ethan could see through the thin veneer of politeness. "Kids' table," his father said lightly, trying to inject humor. "You'll have a better view from here." Ethan's mother chimed in, her voice warm but patronizing. "It's more fun with the other kids. You can eat, laugh, and, not worry about adult stuff." But Ethan wasn't laughing. He wasn't a child anymore. He was nearly 17, tall for his age, and painfully aware of the glaring divide between him and the adults at the main table. This wasn't just a seating arrangement, it was a statement, a subtle reinforcement of exclusion. As he sat down, surrounded by younger cousins and distant relatives, Ethan felt a swirl of emotions: humiliation, anger, and disbelief. The betrayal cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't just about being forced to sit apart, it was about being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by the very people who were supposed to care about his feelings. Through the evening, he observed the adults at the main table. They laughed, discussed trivial matters, and occasionally cast glances toward him that were more performative than genuine. It became painfully clear that his parents had deliberately minimized his presence, treating him as less significant, as if he were not deserving of the same recognition or respect as everyone else. The more Ethan watched, the more his sense of injustice grew. He replayed past moments in his mind, the times his accomplishments were downplayed, the times his opinions were dismissed, and the subtle favoritism shown to his younger siblings. This dinner was not an isolated incident, it was a continuation of a pattern, and tonight it had been made painfully visible. A surge of determination coursed through him. He realized that remaining silent would only reinforce the message his parents were sending. If he wanted to be seen, respected, and acknowledged, he would have to assert himself, but not with childish tantrums or overt confrontation. No, this would require careful thought, strategic planning, and a subtle, undeniable demonstration of his presence and capability. As he picked at the food on his plate, Ethan began to formulate a plan. He would not ruin the dinner or embarrass anyone outright, that would be too obvious and too reactive. Instead, he would orchestrate a quiet, calculated form of revenge that would assert his value, demand recognition, and leave a lasting impression. This was not about anger, it was about justice and self-assertion. For the next week, Ethan observed his parents' routines, noted their priorities, and quietly strategized. He considered ways to showcase his talents, intelligence, and independence in contexts where their dismissiveness would be exposed without him ever having to confront them directly. Every step, every choice, would be deliberate, aimed at creating a moment where his presence could no longer be ignored. He also wrestled with the moral weight of his plan. Revenge could be a dangerous path, but Ethan reminded himself that his approach would not hurt anyone physically or emotionally beyond the truth of acknowledgement. It was not vindictive, it was corrective, a subtle assertion that he deserved respect and recognition. By the evening of his first strategic move, Ethan felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. He knew that the execution would require precision, timing, and composure. Any misstep could diminish the impact, but he also understood that hesitation would only prolong the sense of exclusion he had endured for years. Sitting at the small table during the initial dinner, he observed quietly, smiling politely at those around him, masking the storm of determination brewing beneath the surface. Every laugh from the main table, every glance from his parents, fueled the meticulous planning of his subtle revenge. He was no longer the overlooked child, he was an observer, a strategist, and soon, he would be undeniably present in a way they could not ignore. As the dinner progressed, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about one evening or one slight. This was about asserting his identity, reclaiming his dignity, and proving that exclusion would not define him. The seeds of subtle revenge had been planted, and now, all that remained was careful cultivation. The night of the dinner had left a lingering ache in Ethan's chest. Even days later, he He could still feel the sting of being relegated to the kids' table, while his parents and relatives sat in polished sophistication, exchanging jokes and laughter that seemed deliberately beyond his reach. He replayed every glance, every chuckle, and every subtle dismissal, analyzing each moment with the precision of a strategist. The humiliation had been quiet, almost polite, but it burned all the same. Ethan's room became his refuge and his workshop. He spread out notebooks, scribbled ideas, and plotted scenarios where he could reclaim his presence without resorting to confrontation. He knew that overt anger or a public scene would only serve to reinforce the perception that he was immature, unbalanced, or overly emotional. No, his revenge had to be clever, understated, and psychologically impactful, a demonstration of value they could not ignore. The first thing he realized was that his parents underestimated him. They assumed that he would sulk quietly, that he would internalize the exclusion and retreat into passivity. That assumption became the foundation of his plan. If they expected silence, he would craft visibility. If they expected obedience, he would craft independence. Every element of his strategy hinged on exploiting their blind spots, the very ways they had dismissed him for years. He considered the emotional weight of his approach. Revenge, he knew, was rarely simple. Even subtle acts carried consequences, and he struggled with the moral implications of asserting himself in a way that would highlight their neglect. Was it fair to manipulate situations to make them see him? Could recognition truly be forced without resentment or discomfort? These questions circled in his mind, amplifying the tension he felt between desire and restraint. Ethan's younger siblings, blissfully unaware of the depth of his planning, continued to enjoy their privileges. They were included, celebrated, and praised, receiving the acknowledgement he had been denied. Watching them, Ethan felt a pang of envy mixed with clarity. This wasn't just about one dinner or one slight, it was about a pattern of favoritism, neglect, and invisible hierarchies within the family. His plan needed to address that pattern subtly, leaving no room for doubt that his presence mattered as much as anyone else's. He started by mapping out the environment of the family's social gatherings. The dining hall, the garden, the living room, they all became part of his mental chessboard. He imagined routes, positions, and timings that would allow him to appear at key moments, drawing attention naturally rather than forcing it. He envisioned casual but pointed interactions, gestures of competence and confidence that would contrast with the patronizing attitudes he had endured. The psychological aspect of his plan fascinated him. He realized that true impact would come not from confrontation but from perception. If he could create moments where his parents and relatives saw him thriving, self-assured, and independent, the realization of their underestimation would hit harder than any angry outburst could. It was a quiet, insidious form of revenge, one that would plant doubt, reflection, and awareness. At night, Ethan rehearsed. He practiced body language in the mirror, observing posture, gaze, and subtle facial expressions. He experimented with tones of voice, ensuring that when he spoke, his words carried calm authority rather than desperation or anger. Every detail mattered. The success of his plan depended on precision, subtlety, and psychological insight. As he refined his approach, the emotional struggle deepened. He felt the tension between his desire for recognition and the fear of alienation. What if his actions backfired, creating resentment or conflict that he wasn't prepared to manage? What if his parents dismissed his attempts as arrogance rather than maturity? These doubts gnawed at him, but they also strengthened his resolve. He understood that calculated risk was necessary for change. Ethan also considered timing. Any move he made had to coincide with moments of maximum visibility. He studied past gatherings, noting when attention was typically focused elsewhere and when opportunities for subtle assertion would arise. This wasn't just about being present, it was about commanding attention when the impact would be most undeniable. At the same time, he contemplated the moral dimension of revenge. He did not want to humiliate, manipulate, or hurt anyone. His goal was acknowledgement, not punishment. The subtle acts of assertion he planned were designed to reveal truths, that he was capable, resilient, and deserving of recognition. In that sense, his strategy was as much about personal empowerment as it was about retaliation. Ethan also imagined his parents' reactions. He pictured their surprise, the hesitation in their eyes, the subtle shift in the way they spoke and moved around him. The thought of dismantling years of assumption without confrontation thrilled him. He realized that revenge could be transformative rather than destructive if executed with patience, intelligence, and moral awareness. Over the following week, he put his plans into action in small, seemingly casual ways. He took on responsibilities around the house with quiet competence, demonstrating initiative without seeking praise. He engaged in conversations with relatives with thoughtful insights, subtly revealing knowledge and maturity beyond his years. Each interaction was measured, deliberate, and aimed at creating awareness without overtly stating his grievance. He also nurtured his appearance and demeanor. Clothing, posture, and tone became tools in his arsenal. He presented himself with quiet confidence, the kind that naturally drew attention and respect. Even in casual moments, there was a calm assurance in the way he moved, spoke, and carried himself, a stark contrast to the dismissiveness he had endured at the kids' table. The psychological tension continued to build. Ethan felt a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and exhilaration. Every small interaction was a test, a chance to refine his approach and gauge the impact. He measured reactions carefully, noting shifts in attention, body language, and conversation patterns. His awareness sharpened, and he began to understand the subtle dynamics of influence, perception, and recognition within his family. As the days passed, Ethan's plan became more than a strategy for a single dinner, it became a framework for asserting himself in all future interactions. He realized that exclusion could be transformed into empowerment, and that subtle, deliberate presence could be more impactful than confrontation. The idea of revenge had evolved from a reactive desire to a proactive assertion of self-worth. By the time the next family gathering approached, Ethan felt ready. The culmination of observation, planning, and rehearsal had prepared him to enter the room not as the overlooked child, but as an undeniable presence. He had transformed the sting of exclusion into strategy, the humiliation into motivation, and the desire for recognition into precise action. And so, as the night of the gathering arrived, Ethan felt a mixture of nerves and exhilaration. Every detail, every choice, every small gesture had been anticipated and rehearsed. He was prepared to reveal, subtly and undeniably, that the child relegated to the kids' table was no longer invisible, and that the family who underestimated him would have no choice but to see the person he had become. The evening of the next family gathering arrived with an almost cinematic tension. The restaurant's doors opened to the familiar warm glow of chandeliers and the soft murmur of conversations, yet this time, Ethan was not merely an observer, he was prepared to assert himself, and every step was deliberate. His parents, busy in polite chatter with extended relatives, did not initially notice him. But Ethan didn't need immediate attention, he only needed the right moment to make his presence undeniable. He moved calmly through the room, his posture straight, his head held high. He smiled lightly at a few familiar faces, exchanging greetings with an understated warmth that drew subtle glances from those around him. Every gesture was measured, designed to convey confidence without arrogance. He did not rush to the main table, he assessed the flow of conversation, noting the patterns of attention, and waited for the precise moment to step in. Finally, the opportunity arrived. A lull in the conversation at the main table coincided with a toast. Ethan approached quietly but confidently, standing just at the edge of the group. He waited, letting the subtle shift in energy begin. Some relatives noticed him immediately, blinking in surprise, unsure if he had been there all along. Others cast curious glances, trying to place the confident young man now standing among them. His parents looked up last, caught mid-sentence, and for a moment, there was silence. The familiar dismissiveness that had marked their earlier interactions evaporated in the face of his undeniable presence. His father's brow furrowed slightly, and his mother's polite smile faltered. They had not anticipated this display. They had expected a timid, overlooked teenager. Instead, they saw someone composed, self-assured, and fully aware of the room around him. Ethan's eyes met theirs briefly, steady and unwavering. There was no need for words, the look alone conveyed volumes. Years of being sidelined, underestimated, and dismissed were contained in that silent assertion of presence. The shift was subtle, yet the impact was immediate. Relatives whispered quietly, exchanging glances, sensing the tension and the unspoken story behind it. Taking a seat at the head of a small cluster of chairs near the main table, Ethan positioned himself to be both present and central without being confrontational. He engaged in conversation, offering insights and observations that demonstrated maturity, knowledge, and thoughtfulness. Each comment drew attention naturally, eliciting nods, laughter, and agreement from those around him. It was not about showing off, it was about making his value undeniable. His parents attempted to interject politely, but Ethan navigated the conversation with a calm authority that subtly shifted the dynamics. They could not dismiss him without appearing rude, nor could they ignore his presence without acknowledging the truth they had long avoided. Every smile, every nod from other relatives reinforced his position, and he could see the subtle realization dawn in his parents' eyes. They had underestimated him, and now the consequences of that underestimation were visible to everyone. The psychological tension intensified as the evening progressed. Ethan noticed the glances exchanged between his parents, the slight stiffening of posture, the hesitations in speech. They were confronting the undeniable fact that their oversight had been visible, that the child relegated to the kids' table was no longer invisible, and that recognition could not be avoided. It was a silent, sophisticated form of revenge, one that spoke louder than confrontation ever could. Ethan also took care to engage his younger cousins and siblings in conversation, subtly demonstrating leadership and maturity. He included everyone at the table, showing that his presence was not meant to exclude but to assert equality. The contrast between his poised confidence and their parents' initial dismissiveness amplified the psychological impact. Recognition was being claimed not through anger, but through presence, intellect, and subtle social mastery. By the time dessert was served, the shift was undeniable. His parents, once the orchestrators of exclusion, now found themselves adjusting to the reality of his presence. Their polite smiles and tentative conversation were tinged with acknowledgement. They could no longer ignore him, and the room had silently taken notice. Ethan had claimed visibility, demanded recognition, and asserted his value in a way that was both elegant and powerful. Throughout the evening, he felt a mix of satisfaction, relief, and calm triumph. The act of subtle revenge had not required humiliation or conflict. Instead, it had been executed with precision, patience, and psychological insight. The impact was profound, lasting, and carried the moral clarity he had sought. This was revenge as assertion, empowerment, and recognition, a quiet but undeniable victory. By the end of the dinner, Ethan had established his presence without a word of accusation. His parents, while maintaining their polite demeanor, could not ignore the shift in dynamics. Other relatives had begun to see him differently, some even expressing admiration for his composure and intellect. Ethan's subtle strategy had transformed a moment of exclusion into a demonstration of self-respect, maturity, and social influence. As the family prepared to leave, Ethan excused himself gracefully, leaving his parents and relatives to process the subtle but powerful impact of his presence. The night had been a turning point, not in confrontation, but in acknowledgement. He had not sought revenge through anger or drama, he had achieved it through deliberate assertion, strategic engagement, and unwavering composure. Walking out into the cool night air, Ethan felt a profound sense of closure. The humiliation of the kids' table had been transformed into empowerment, the sting of exclusion into strategic victory. He understood, as he breathed in the evening breeze, that revenge could be subtle, intelligent, and morally grounded. It was not about hurting others, it was about asserting oneself, reclaiming dignity, and ensuring that invisibility was no longer an option. And in that quiet victory, Ethan realized the ultimate lesson: the most powerful revenge is often the one that transforms pain into presence, exclusion into recognition, and injustice into subtle but undeniable assertion of self-worth. The following days were a strange mixture of calm and tension for Ethan. The family dinner, which had initially seemed like an ordinary event, had transformed into a turning point, and the echoes of his quiet, calculated assertion lingered in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. At home, the atmosphere was noticeably different. His parents' demeanor had shifted subtly, his father's habitual casual dismissiveness was replaced by a careful politeness, and his mother's warm but condescending tone now carried a hint of restraint. They hadn't said much directly, but their awareness of Ethan's presence and capability was palpable in every interaction. Ethan noticed it in small, almost imperceptible ways. His father now asked his opinion on matters he had once ignored, like planning weekend activities or decisions about household purchases. The questions were hesitant at first, as if testing whether Ethan would assert himself again, but they gradually became more genuine. It was clear that his parents were recalibrating their perception of him, not as the overlooked child relegated to the kids' table, but as someone capable, composed, and undeniably mature. Even among extended family, the shift was visible. Relatives who had previously dismissed his comments or overlooked his presence now engaged him in conversation with interest, seeking his insights or simply acknowledging him in ways they hadn't before. The subtle, psychological revenge Ethan had executed had ripple effects, quietly altering the way others interacted with him. Recognition was no longer optional, it was now a natural response to his presence. Despite the satisfaction of this change, Ethan wrestled with complex emotions. Revenge, even subtle and morally grounded, carried weight. He had achieved acknowledgement without confrontation, but he couldn't ignore the lingering questions. Did this shift in behavior come from genuine respect, or merely from awareness of his strategic assertion? Had he exposed his parents to a kind of humility that would create long-term tension, or had he opened the door to more authentic relationships? The line between empowerment and manipulation felt thinner than he expected. He spent hours reflecting on the nature of his actions. On one hand, he felt a quiet triumph. He had transformed exclusion into presence, invisibility into recognition, and humiliation into subtle authority. The act was clever, controlled, and morally measured. On the other hand, he understood that revenge, even thoughtful, non-destructive revenge, altered relationships in ways that could not always be predicted. The dynamics of family, once shifted, rarely returned to their previous state, and the acknowledgement he had gained came at the cost of a subtle tension that lingered beneath polite smiles. In the days following the dinner, Ethan experimented with his new social standing. He engaged more confidently in family discussions, offered thoughtful suggestions during planning for holidays and gatherings, and even helped mediate disputes between younger cousins. His parents observed these actions with a mixture of admiration, caution, and a hint of guilt, admitting, at least unconsciously, that they had underestimated him for years. Interestingly, Ethan also noticed changes in his own self-perception. The act of subtle revenge had reinforced his confidence, resilience, and strategic thinking. He realized that the power of influence was not in overt confrontation or anger, but in calm, deliberate action that commanded acknowledgement naturally. The experience was transformative, not just socially but personally. He felt more grounded, more aware of his capabilities, and more certain of his value. However, the moral lessons of this experience weighed heavily on him. He considered the emotional journey of his parents, the subtle humiliation they must have felt, and the ripple effects on family dynamics. While his revenge had been calculated, non-destructive, and empowering, it had still forced them to confront their own shortcomings and biases. Ethan reflected on whether true understanding and empathy could emerge from such experiences, or whether they would remain defensive, rationalizing their previous behavior. He also reflected on his relationship with younger siblings. They had witnessed his transformation, and for some, it was inspiring, for others, it was confusing. Ethan realized that the subtle display of power and recognition could teach lessons about resilience, intelligence, and assertiveness, but it could also unintentionally create envy, comparison, or feelings of inadequacy. The moral complexity of revenge, even subtle revenge, was more intricate than he had anticipated. As the weeks passed, the initial tension softened into a new equilibrium. His parents' interactions with him became more balanced and thoughtful, though occasionally still tinged with residual guilt or hesitation. The family had adjusted to a dynamic where Ethan's presence demanded respect, but they had not yet fully integrated the lessons of acknowledgement into deeper emotional understanding. For Ethan, this was both a victory and a reminder that true change in relationships required more than strategic assertion. It required communication, empathy, and sustained mutual respect. Ethan's reflections also extended to the broader concept of revenge itself. He realized that revenge, even when executed with moral clarity and precision, was a double-edged sword. It could empower, correct injustice, and demand recognition, but it also carried the risk of altering relationships in ways that could not always be controlled. The satisfaction of being seen, of asserting one's worth, was profound, but the long-term consequences required ongoing reflection, careful navigation, and humility. In private moments, Ethan acknowledged a subtle truth: the act of revenge had been as much about personal growth as about social impact. By planning, executing, and observing the outcomes, he had developed skills in patience, strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and self-confidence. He had transformed a moment of exclusion into an opportunity for self-assertion and personal empowerment, learning lessons that extended far beyond the family dinner itself. Yet he also recognized that the experience left open questions. Would his parents truly internalize the lessons of acknowledgement and fairness? Would the subtle shift in family dynamics evolve into deeper respect, understanding, and connection, or would it remain a surface-level recognition driven by awareness of strategy rather than genuine insight? These questions lingered, underscoring the complexity of revenge as a moral and emotional tool. By the end of this reflective period, Ethan arrived at a nuanced understanding. Revenge, he realized, was most effective when it balanced assertion with empathy, strategy with moral awareness, and recognition with restraint. It was not about humiliation, punishment, or dominance. It was about demonstrating value, reclaiming dignity, and creating space for acknowledgement that could lead to more authentic relationships. The family, now subtly aware of his presence and capability, had been forced to reconsider their assumptions, adjust their behaviors, and confront the consequences of past neglect. Ethan, meanwhile, had transformed a moment of exclusion into a platform for empowerment, learning lessons that would shape his approach to social dynamics, self-respect, and moral decision-making for years to come. And in that quiet reflection, he understood the final lesson. Revenge could satisfy, empower, and illuminate truths, but its ultimate value lay in the balance between assertion and conscience, between impact and empathy, and between the desire to be seen and the wisdom to navigate relationships thoughtfully. Months passed since that pivotal dinner, and life settled into a rhythm that, while familiar, had been subtly transformed. Ethan's parents continued to navigate their awareness of his presence with a careful mix of pride, guilt, and renewed respect. The dynamics of the household had shifted in ways that were not immediately dramatic but unmistakably real. They no longer treated him as the overlooked child, the one who could be relegated to the edges of family gatherings or dismissed without consequence. Recognition had been earned, quietly and deliberately, and it lingered in every interaction. Ethan found a quiet satisfaction in this change, but he also recognized the limitations of subtle revenge. While it had achieved its intended goal, acknowledgement and respect, it had also left behind a shadow of tension. His parents, now acutely aware of their past favoritism, sometimes hesitated in ways that made conversations feel strained. The very act of asserting himself had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths, and while this confrontation was necessary, it had not been entirely painless. He reflected on the broader implications of his strategy. Revenge, even subtle and morally grounded, was a double-edged sword. It could empower and correct, but it could also reshape relationships in ways that demanded ongoing attention and emotional intelligence. Ethan realized that the true measure of success was not merely in having been seen or acknowledged, but in how the newfound respect could evolve into authentic, lasting connections. Interestingly, the subtle revenge had also impacted his siblings. Some viewed his composure and strategic presence as aspirational, inspiring them to assert themselves in their own ways. Others, however, seemed momentarily unsettled, unsure how to navigate the altered dynamics. Ethan recognized that even carefully executed actions could ripple outward, affecting not only the intended targets but the broader social environment in ways that were complex and unpredictable. In his private moments, Ethan reflected on his personal growth. The process had demanded patience, careful observation, and strategic thinking. He had learned to navigate social hierarchies, understand psychological cues, and assert himself without resorting to aggression or overt confrontation. Most importantly, he had transformed humiliation into opportunity, exclusion into empowerment, and anger into measured action. These lessons would shape his approach to relationships, social situations, and moral decision-making for years to come. Yet Ethan also understood that revenge, even when subtle, was not a permanent solution. Recognition could be maintained, but respect and understanding required ongoing effort. He could not assume that a single evening or a single strategic move would erase years of neglect or automatically create empathy. True change, he realized, demanded consistency, communication, and the cultivation of trust over time. Looking back, he acknowledged the emotional complexity of his journey. There had been moments of exhilaration, pride, and satisfaction, but also moments of doubt, moral questioning, and introspection. He had wrestled with the ethical dimensions of his actions, asking whether recognition gained through strategy could coexist with genuine familial connection. The answer, he concluded, lay in balance, using intelligence and composure to assert presence, while nurturing empathy and understanding to foster meaningful relationships. Ethan also contemplated the broader moral lesson of his experience. Revenge, even subtle and intelligent, was rarely about punishment. Its value lay in transformation, of perception, of self-confidence, and of relational dynamics. When executed thoughtfully, it could illuminate truths, correct injustices, and demand acknowledgement. But it also required self-awareness, restraint, and a willingness to consider the emotional consequences for oneself and others. In the months that followed, family gatherings became more inclusive and balanced. His parents treated him with consistent respect, acknowledging his insights and opinions without prompting. Relatives who had previously overlooked him engaged in conversations with genuine interest, and even his siblings began to recognize his quiet authority in family dynamics. Ethan's subtle revenge had evolved into a platform for ongoing empowerment and constructive interaction, shaping the social environment in ways that extended beyond a single act. Ethan's final reflection was clear and measured. Revenge, when executed thoughtfully, could achieve acknowledgement and assert dignity without descending into cruelty or conflict. It could transform pain into presence, exclusion into recognition, and humiliation into empowerment. Yet the ultimate lesson was deeper. The true power of any act of revenge lay not in the act itself, but in the wisdom to balance assertion with empathy, impact with moral responsibility, and self-interest with the cultivation of authentic relationships. As he walked away from the memory of the kids' table, Ethan carried with him more than satisfaction. He carried clarity. He understood that life's subtle injustices could be confronted with intelligence, patience, and moral awareness. Recognition could be earned, dignity could be reclaimed, and even the sting of exclusion could be transformed into opportunity. And in that understanding, Ethan found a profound sense of empowerment that would guide him far beyond the walls of any dining hall, any family gathering, or any moment of perceived neglect. The quiet revenge had been a success, not because it humiliated or punished, but because it illuminated truth, asserted value, and transformed the dynamics of recognition. And as Ethan looked toward the future, he realized that the lessons of this journey would remain with him, shaping not only how he navigated family, but how he approached life, relationships, and the moral complexities of asserting oneself in a world that often overlooks the quiet but capable. In the end, revenge had not merely satisfied, it had taught, transformed, and illuminated a path toward dignity, recognition, and self-respect that no dinner, no slight, and no act of exclusion could ever erase.